G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic Saturday. It's the weekend, we all look forward to it. I even look forward to it and it doesn't really change my working week. But legends, as always, we have a lot to go over. And one thing I will say is Ukraine today has been fairly slow on the news front. But we're going to talk about Ukraine. We're going to look at some footage. Of course, we're going to look at the maps and a new Ukrainian weapon system that is entering service, as well as some tidbits around everything there. So we will compare the maps, all of that right in the very beginning. Then I want to talk about Syria. And I want to talk about Syria in relation to how it may affect the Russian forces present in Syria and what problems can that create for the Kremlin as far as geopolitical, of where warships may go, where planes may go, and Russia's presence and influence in Syria and how that could relate to the war in Ukraine. And of course, I need to talk about Romania. The presidential elections in Romania have been thrown out and will need to be apparently rerun. But the candidate who was leading is looking like he will not be allowed to run either. And this is framed on Russian interference. So we will talk all about that as well. But firstly, let's talk about Ukraine. Let's look at what is happening. So here is Ukraine in the center of your screen. Of course, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The blue you see within Ukraine's borders is area that Ukraine has made in the last 2 weeks. The red check is what Russia has made in the past 24 hours. So look, let's come down onto the maps and just have a quick look at what is occurring. And before we get right into this, of course, we have the Kurakhove, Pokrovsk front and Velika Novosilka, incredibly important areas. And we do see, in my opinion, that this offensive is slowing down. And I believe a big factor of that is, firstly, the weather, the colder, wetter weather, and secondly, how long Russia has been on the offensive. May we see a slowdown for a few weeks and then an increase in speed as things on the ground start to freeze, physically freeze, we will see. But let's talk about some tactics and how many people are seeing the war. So I found this interesting today from Ukraine Battle Map. Things go slowly at first, then suddenly accelerate at a rapid pace. It's seen with the collapse of Syria today, the Kherson, Kharkiv and Kursk offensives, Russia's retreat from Kyiv and the Soviet Union collapse. People didn't believe it would happen, and all of a sudden it did. And this goes into what I say, this is the bankruptcy theory we can apply to war. Little by little and then all at once. The piece that is missing in this, and I agree exactly with what he said, I've said similarly many times, the thing that is missing, though, is that this applies both ways. Don't act like it's just one way things can collapse. Look at Afghanistan for the coalition, for example. So things can collapse quickly the other way as well. And this is the race I think many people are seeing at the moment, is the race to victory is between what will collapse first. Will the Russian economy collapse first? Or will Ukraine have a military frontline territorial collapse first? That is how many people are seeing this. And me, as a neutral observer of this, having conversations with professionals and specialists about the economy and myself looking at the front line, I would say at this point in time, it is far more likely we're going to see a breakthrough frontline collapse rather than a complete economic collapse in Russia. But he is correct here, whether it is military movements grinding forward or inflated spending on the military, therefore inflation, all of this, it can be little by little then a collapse. But don't think that this cannot occur the other way. And I believe a military collapse of the Ukrainian forces is more likely than an economic collapse in Russia. And I am doing a 2-hour video specifically on that. But what we do see is this continual grind forward on many different fronts. So today we have the red check in many areas, but it needs to be remembered that Russia is pushing in Velika Novosilka, Kurakhove, Ilininkia, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and all the way up into the north, not only within Ukraine's borders, but outside of Ukraine's borders. They're pushing in Kursk as well. And we have spoken about attritional warfare. You push on many shallow fronts at a time. If you are the numerically superior force, you're going to keep your adversary on the back foot, trying to close those gaps. And this first was developed in World War I by a Russian commander, Brusilov. So before this, it was assumed that you would have a breakthrough at a single point, and then you'd exploit that breakthrough of those trenches, of that very front line. The problem with this is it means that enemy resources, your adversary's resources, can be allocated to that area. What Brusilov brought to the battlefield in the summer of 1916 was shallow attacks along a vast front line, and the very beginning somewhat of combined artillery maneuver warfare and attritional pushing on many different sectors. And this was a big change on the front lines and warfare since. The thing with this is, though, it did at the time and still does massively test and put a lot more pressure on your supply lines. This, of course, in 1916, in the early 20th century, is of course before the days of modern transport. But it's also before the days of drones. So has logistics got any easier? I would say probably not. If you're outside of artillery range at this point in time, you can move fairly freely. Of course, our vehicles are better at moving now, but we have drones, we've got longer artillery, we have missiles, all of this. Though, the breakthrough in the offensive attack, in the Brusilov offensive, named after the Russian general Alexei A. Brusilov, who created the first modern offensive attack with the methodology of an offensive attack at various points on the enemy's entrenched lines. Breakthrough or numerous breakthroughs at given points, as well as the immediate shock value of initial attack during various intervals. And this is what I believe Russia is doing in Ukraine. They're pushing on many different areas, having shallow attacks, so it doesn't ever look like one large breakthrough, but you're pushing on so many different areas that it is really stretching the opposing side. In this case, Ukraine is really stretching them due to being numerically inferior numbers. It is stretching that and creates chaos in one area. If current military historians and military theorists study what Brusilov achieved against the Austrian-Hungarian forces along the Eastern Front, then there will be a deeper understanding, for instance, of what the modern Russian armed forces may desire to achieve should they invade the vast territory of the Ukraine in our time. So, of course, this was written before 2022. But it gives us a good idea of what Russia may have done. So he's predicting this. Furthermore, I believe this is what we are seeing upon the front lines. And if we go further, Brusilov avoided the traditional practice of focusing all forces on a single narrow front, which was predictable. Instead, he launched attacks across multiple sectors simultaneously. This forced the Austro-Hungarian and German forces to spread their defences thin and left them unable to reinforce any single point effectively. Again, attacks that are simultaneous and successive. And I've said this again and again and again. To have success on areas, whether it is with missiles, whether it is with troops, whether it's with tanks, whatever, in an attritional protracted war, especially against these systems, it needs to be simultaneous and successive. And this is why that Kursk offensive then stalled out after a few weeks. Not only was it the Russian resistance, but we were expecting a simultaneous attack and a successive attacks going on from that, but it has really slowed down. And I could say that is very similar to what Russia has done in Vovchansk. That initial movement in Vovchansk-Lipsy has slowed down. It wasn't simultaneous and successive, but you could say, well, it was simultaneous with other front lines. So it just gives us an idea of what tactics may be implemented, and that is at least something that has influenced how I see the Russian command decisions, at least as an observer on the maps. So let's actually have a look at what has changed. Let's actually start in Chasiv Yar. So of course we have Bakhmut, somewhere you're familiar with. Chasiv Yar here. Of course, over the past few days we have seen some Russian control expanding into Chasiv Yar. Then we'll look on the Syriac maps, and he's showing just a bit more control to the north as well in the south, in this forest belt here as well. So further expansion pushing through Chasiv Yar, but of course a very, very hard area to push through. But beyond Chasiv Yar, towards Kramatorsk-Sloviansk, those rolling hills, which help massively in defense, massively with artillery, they do start to really flatten out beyond Chasiv Yar. Let's come down then Kursk. And we can see that this area has come under Russian control. We know there's presence well out into these Tetecons as well. I have another map to show you, Syriac map here, and he's showing not only the control further out and basically this whole area, but much more control in the center of Kursk itself, then advancing along these streets as well as this mine. Of course, there's a lot of fighting, not only on the surface, but below the surface in many different areas too in Ukraine, from mines through to even just basements as well. Very, very difficult. That's what I was seeing. Like I touched on those TM62M mines being used, those AT mines. So let's push down just a little bit further and we come onto the Pokrovsk front. And as you can see from the deep state Ukrainian map today, there is expansion into areas right on the outskirts of Shevchenko. Now, the important part, I believe, of this is it gives us an idea of how far are the Russian forces from the very outskirts of Pokrovsk. And we're looking at well under 5 kilometers. This is 4.16. Let's come up then from there to somewhat, I can't do that for some reason. Let's go to the nearing center of Pokrovsk, about 7 kilometers. Now, one of the important things with this is the closer and closer this gets, especially well within inside that 10 kilometer, maybe 5 kilometer, is your FPV drones will have even better connection. And it may bring into the fold those fiber optic drones as well, as we do believe the absolute max is probably 10 kilometers. The problem is with the fiber optic drone though, is if it goes one way and then the other, it's not 10 kilometers as the bird flies, or as the crow flies. If you fly in a dead straight line, maybe. But if you zigzag forward and back, that is going to greatly limit your range on that due to its 10 kilometers of cable, not 10 kilometers of signal. So that is an important area, pushing up on Pokrovsk out from Zavote as well. Let's have a look at a few things we've got here. We don't really have many Syriac maps today, but I want to look at a few importance around here. Now, again, in bold letters, I have put claimed on these because it is claimed by Russian pages. So at about this location, this is the train line out of Pokrovsk. Russian pages have been sharing this footage showing a FPV drone, at least striking near to, we can't see if it hits or not, it goes, then just loses signal, onto a train. One thing we can see is snow on the ground. This looks similar to this time of year. I've tried to look for geolocations off pages of which I typically take geolocations from, and they haven't looked at this footage yet. I've had a look myself, and there's not enough for me to say that this is or isn't. But if that is, it is a factor of this train line to bring in and out resources out of Pokrovsk. Now, what damage could an FPV drone do to a train? Well, at the end of the day, an RPG warhead can push through hundreds of millimeters of rolled homogeneous armour. These trains are not armoured. It will definitely push through there. The main bit is how large a train is. It may miss critical components. But on the engine like this, there's a lot of critical components, and this could absolutely force the train to stop. So as far as stopping the train, FPV drones can definitely do that, regardless of how large the train itself is. So let's push a little bit further down, and we see around Dalnay more ground being made right around this pocket that has developed around Ilinikia. So I'll show you, we have another Syriac map update here, and he is showing this spire that has come down to Uspenivkia as well, where the Russians have moved up, really creating a lot of pressure on this pocket that is being enveloped currently. I do believe we will see a large withdrawal out of that area sooner rather than later. Velika Novosilka. Now, no changes on any of the maps that I follow today. There are always changes on other maps, but I'm sort of set in the ones that I use, but I'm open to recommendations. Of course, what we have seen is the Ukrainian offensive into Novaya Komar. Now, some Russian pages are saying this didn't occur, or it did and it wasn't as successful. But regardless, the Syriac and the Deep State show that there was a successful attack. So I myself am saying that there was a successful attack here. But what we have said is these roads are critical and they're not far away from front lines. Now, again, this is only claimed footage. What we can see is it's right on this bridge right here. I've looked for official geolocations off pages with which I follow, so not really official, but of which have a very good reputation. I can't find it, and I've looked myself, and the time of year is just so different in the images, it's hard to tell. But what we can see here is, if this is by the bridge, that multiple Russian drones, so we can see this drone coming in here, fixed wing, and then this FPV then observing strikes on a vehicle here and observing strikes then further drones underneath this bridge. So the reason I bring this up is can show just because an area bridge is within Ukrainian territory, within Russian-held territory, doesn't mean that it's definitely passable as well. As you can see, many vehicles getting struck there by many different drones, and both ISR and lethal drones are working in tandem, particularly around this area. And I would not be surprised by this at all. What I have said is this road is only 2.6 kilometers away from Russian-held territory, and Rivnepil to this other road is only 3 kilometers. These are very important roads, but well within range of FPV drone strikes. Speaking of drones, Ukraine has released officially a new drone. It's called the Hell missile drone. And this is claimed to be capable of speeds up to 700 kilometers an hour and a range over 700 kilometers. There has been a lot of doubts I've seen around the speed and range, because compared to the Storm Shadow, this has way longer range, like significantly longer range, and isn't that much slower. And many have pointed at the drag of something like this compared to a Storm Shadow, as well as the amount of thrust in the engine. So there are some doubts around that, but again, we will see when these come into service and what they can attack. And it has been officially handed over to the armed forces of Ukraine. So we will see if these are made en masse, like this photograph shows, if it will have an effect on the front. And I have said I believe drones like this en masse are significantly more important than having limited ATACMS or limited Storm Shadow scalp. Not only due to limited numbers, but also due to every Storm Shadow scalp ATACMS is having to go through this whole bloody policy through the US and the UK, and can we hit this target? Can we use it in this area? But if Ukraine have its own domestic assets like that in large numbers, we have seen, in my opinion, drones in large numbers have been significantly more successful for the Ukrainians than their limited amount of long-range missiles. So there is a lot happening around the world, and a lot that influences this war, the West, geopolitics as a whole. Of course, Romania and Syria. So look, let's start with Syria, and then we'll talk about the claimed Russian interference in the Romanian elections and how I see that that can really, really cause divide in NATO and the EU, and the threat that that is really causing to their strength, the power and influence that these alliances and groups have externally. So what we need to have a look at is a couple of maps and what Fighter Bomber has said about the situation in Syria. So of course we're talking about this area right here in Syria. We'll get back to this map in a second. We zoom into Syria. Now, this is important. So the red on this map, this is Syriac maps to give him credit. The red on this is currently the Assad regime's control. Outside of this is by a number of other groups, but these large attacks. You'll see areas like Idlib, areas like Hama, and area like Homs, of which I'm sure you're familiar with at this point in time. But this is what we need to look at, is where are some, not all, but where are some of the Russian assets or areas that Russia will really want to hold and keep in either their control or control of Assad. So at the Latakia, this is Syria's largest port. Just below this, we have a large Russian airbase. We have Tartas here, which is another major port. Plus it is Russia's only formal overseas naval base, and of course then the only one for Russia in the Mediterranean. And there could be potential withdrawal issues if the Russian Navy is pushed out of this area, but more on that as a sec, as it applies to the other map that I showed you first. Let's look at what Fighter Bomber has said, and we'll go back and forth on that map to show you a few things. It is still difficult to make any predictions about the situation in Syria. It can be stated that the situation is about the same as in 2015, except for one factor. The factor of the emergence of drones. Drones have changed warfare for everyone. especially smaller forces, with the ability to cripple larger forces, from naval ships to helicopters to tanks. And this has really leveled the battlefield. And like I've said many, many times, if the coalition went back into Afghan now, it would be significantly different, likely with the same outcome that all other superpowers who have marched into Afghanistan have left with. Drones, which no one anywhere has learned how to reliably fight against, no one has, especially with then fibre optic drones coming into the battlefield in Ukraine now, but we will see these everywhere, that a lot of the solutions people are giving are EW. That will have no effect. And the drone technology, we're at the very infancy of drone technology. All other weapons of the Islamists do not differ much in quality or quantity from what they had in 15. The people are the same. How does this difference threaten us? It threatens us with the loss of the airstrike component, which accounts for 75% of the combat capability of our troops in the ATS. The Hermem airfield, so this is the one right up here, but I couldn't make the label stick up with how zoomed out I wanted to be, is not a multi-story promo project with basements. It is a field with lightly assembled houses on top, which will cease to function as soon as the enemy either comes within range of artillery fire or within range of drones. So I've shown you here, this is about 80 kilometers or 50 miles. Let's say it's about 50 kilometers then. Drones, we're looking at a maximum around 10 Ks. RT, realistically, maybe here around 20-ish, but it will be very important if that then occurs. And here already, to apply manoeuvre aviation, which saves us on the big land, will not work. There's nowhere to pull out, and this is the problem. If you're in Russia, you can move these planes around. You can manoeuvre your aviation, again, save us on the big land. But here, there's nowhere to pull out. That is the airbase. Where do you go from here? In fact, the only spare airfields left in Syria are 2 airfields. This is a critical minimum. The situation with the naval base in Tartus is about the same. Of course, it can be defended and held for quite a long time if there is someone and something to do, but it will either not be able to function at all or be very limited. So the things we need to talk about in here is these planes. These, of course, do have the range to go to maybe Iran or back to Russia. That can happen with air-to-air refueling, although it will be a big bloody effort. But of course, he's saying as well, with these ports, if the same happens that could happen at this airbase up here, get in range of drones and artillery, it's very able to be defended, but you're going to need people there to do it, but it also will reduce what functionality that has. And this is Homs here at the moment, and we do know that there are a lot of claims that Homs has entry of the militants, other claims saying they have not, and this is allegedly footage of Russian choppers, this being a Kar-52, leaving Homs to either the naval base or the larger air base. Either, of course, that footage can't be geolocated. There's nothing in it but sky. It is practically impossible to evacuate the bases. At best, you can evacuate most of the personnel, documentation, and transfer serviceable aircraft. Some equipment, which on the move, can be on dry cargo ships and landing ships to spread. But, of course, not all. So those ships at that naval base can move. Or then the largest port further up in Latakia. So, furthermore, resistance to drones is also limited by distance from the big land with a supply of missiles and SAMs, and if it comes to an FPV. So, again, talking about those air defense systems on one area and the size and FPV and your more larger style drones. But up here, when we talk about the amount of equipment and moving that out, I think a perfect example of this is think about the T-Man and the withdrawal of Kabul and the amount that got left behind there. So the main task of our forces in Syria is to prevent the enemy from entering Latakia, even if we have to temporarily give up the rest of the territory. And with what and how to do it is clear in theory, but how it will look like in practice we will soon see. We should not be surprised at the speed of the enemy's seizure of territory. It works both ways. And this is what we're seeing. We're still in this early manoeuvre phase, similar to what we saw in the opening weeks of the war in 2022, similar to what we saw in the opening weeks of the Kursk Offensive in 2024. After this early phase, which lasts a few weeks, things will slow down logistically and fatigue as well, fatigue on men and equipment. And at that point in time, will those lines of communications, the logistics supply, will that catch up to how far these forces have moved? Again, we will see. And he ends with this: we continue to watch, but the fact that the initiative is not on our side and the situation is very difficult and cannot be denied. So the situation here is very difficult. Of course, we can see the amount of ground being made, and then the Russians have limited amount of areas in here as well if they want to stay. Some are saying they may just pack up and leave and go, see you, Assad, and go from there, which, like I've spoken about earlier in this, could mean the further allocation of assets into the I country, you can't say, or back into Russia that we may see pop up on the front line in Ukraine. That said, the amount of assets here is still very limited. We're talking 20 to 30 fixed wing aircraft. I'm not sure about rotary wing. But let's look at a few things here. These ports, so this airbase can move equipment to Latakia if it needs to, saying this is a critical area. And we see the other large, specifically naval base down here also. But many have said, well, Russia's going to get stuck with Navy ships in here. And we can see how this can really affect. So, of course, this is Syria. We have Israel. We have the I country. We have Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, and the routes out of the Mediterranean. So let me show you a couple of things on here. So if these ships were forced to leave Syria, they have really two ways out. Well, really three, but they are not allowed to cross through the Bosphorus, of course, in Istanbul, Turkey, into the Black Sea to get across to Crimea or across to the Russian mainland. They can go out through Suez Canal. There should be no problems with this due to the neutrality, and that is, of course, through Egypt and bordering these countries out through the Red Sea. The Houthis are not going to fire weapon systems at those ships. Now, they could also cross out through the Gibraltar. So legally, due to the neutrality of navigation in the sea, Russia can go through the Med, through the other seas, and out through the Gibraltar, although they then will be, of course, within sight of Spain, and NATO will very closely monitor this, and there are concerns about logistical support or support if there was a problem on a ship that way also due to the sanctions. So probably through a Suez if they were to leave. And many have said, well, then could Russia withdraw naval assets to Iran, or do they want to come up through the Baltic and in near St. Petersburg? But you can see, if other countries become NATO in the future, the problems that this does cause for Russia. So you can see that Finland and Sweden, these of course have recently become NATO countries, turning the Baltic Sea into basically a NATO pond, with Russia just in here at St. Petersburg. Of course, then we look down around the Black Sea. Turkey, of course, is a NATO country supporting Syria. Again, I'll say it more and more, I don't think Turkey should be able to turn on and off its NATO membership regarding what it wants to do. You either are in or you are out. Anyway, Turkey is a NATO country. Ukraine wants to become a NATO country, and we're hearing that it is on the cards for the future, that they are on an irreversible path to NATO membership. We've heard very similar about Georgia. Of course, what does this do? Well, we'll talk about Romania in a second. So this is the Black Sea completely surrounded, basically, by NATO. This causes a lot of issues for Russia if they fail to maintain control of Crimea. So you can see where getting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO can absolutely help the alliance and their influence in this part of Eurasia, especially the Black Sea, and navigation through into the Red Sea or through out into the Mediterranean as well. There's a hell of a lot of influence right in here. What will occur? Well, again, I don't have a crystal ball. We spoke about Romania there, of course, that NATO country on the border as well. So let's look at exactly what is happening in Romania and how this could really stir things up in the EU and in NATO. And this is what I've said. The greatest victory for a Sino-Russian relationship, Russia and China, the greatest victory would be a reduction in control and power and division within NATO and the EU, and there's a hell of a lot of that. Look at the French government, look at the German government, and now look at Romania too. Now, there's three certainties. This is quoting when it was going through the campaign in 2017. Three certainties: death, tax, and Russian influence on elections. Bucharest, Reuters. Romania's top court annulled an ongoing presidential election after accusations of Russian meddling and ruled on Friday the entire process, which had been due to conclude this weekend, would have to be rerun. Cancelling it. People have gone out, they've voted everything. Cancel it, rerun it. The second round had been scheduled for Sunday, and voting has already begun in the polling stations abroad. It would have pitted Călin Georgescu, a far-right pro-Russian candidate, against a pro-European Union centrist leader, Elena Lasconi. Again, to become far-right or pro-Russian, the threshold is significantly low if you live particularly in Europe. But he does not support further aid to Ukraine. That is for sure. And I'm not completely over Mr. Georgescu's policies. The electoral process to elect Romania's president will be fully rerun, and the government will set a new date and calendar for the necessary steps. This is from the court. Many are claiming that this is an insider coup. Georgescu scored single-digit numbers in opinion polls. Again, opinion polls, as we have seen both times with President-elect Donald Trump, mean very little, but then surged to a first-place finish that raised questions over the result. Georgescu wants to end Romanian support for Ukraine against Russia's invasion. If he won this presidency, it would upend the pro-Western politics of the EU and NATO member, pushing Romania closer to a belt of states in Central and Eastern Europe that have a powerful, populist, Russian-friendly politicians, including Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria. Now, I push back on a lot of this, saying there's a lot of countries here that are looking inwardly, less so outwardly. And I think Trump is very similar here. You could paint Trump as this far-right, pro-Russian figure, but I believe what this is looking at the very base of this is the looking inwardly and going, what is the best in our borders, not maybe externally for everyone. And the balance between the right and wrong of how much should you look in and how much should you look out in sovereign independent states, but sovereign independent states that are part of alliances, that is where things get incredibly tricky. But I think this trickiness can become a huge problem. So of course this is Ukraine here. You can just see the outskirts of Russia around here. But here we have Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria. These countries, which Reuters are claiming are friendly to the Kremlin, in here. Just to give you an idea of where this sits. States at this point in the globe, they need to be part of a security and economic alliance. Unless you are a large nuclear power, you really have to be part of one of these alliances. You give up some of your sovereignty and some of your independence to be part of economic and military alliances. So if you're part of NATO or EU or any of these, you give up some level of that, but then you adopt military or economic security. And of course, the countries that have joined these alliances see this as a fair trade. But I do think there is a real threat of what we see in Western and Central European Union politics, and how people will say this has lost its way. It's just become a quote woke politics or left idealistic politics. And that this could push more and more people and therefore countries in democratic systems to become more right-wing or more traditionalist. I prefer the term maybe traditionalist here, in particularly if we look into traditional religion as well. And there is a threat that measures like this, like we're seeing happening in Romania, like we're seeing in other areas, but we'll stay on this one, as well as these politics in Western and Central Europe, can push more conservative or religious traditional states away from this. And like I said in the beginning, that in this period in the globe, if you are not a great nuclear state, you're not a state that can have that amount of independence and sovereignty, you need to be in a partnership. And could we see over the next decade or longer or quicker, we don't really know, could we see a move of some of these states saying, well, our values, these align more with maybe Eurasia, potentially Russia or other countries, rather than the trajectory that we are seeing maybe Western and Central Europe on, as many states are pushing back against this. Could we see things like this go, we don't want to be part of it, or even if not part of it, it just creates division in these systems, which division in a system like this may as well be a malignant cancer growth. The strength in this is together. Singularly, no. And this is why if there was movement away, they have to move in the sphere of influence one way or another. And like I've said, why do you think Putin and the Kremlin, through either external operations, maybe through the SVR, is leaning so much into Russia being pinned as the last bastion of traditional values? The decrees we see released and signed by Putin for escaping neoliberal estates. This is just a tooth in a very large cog of the hybrid warfare campaign to try and paint Russia as a traditional bastion of those values. And we see this through SBR operations in Asia as well as Africa, and as well, a byproduct of this may go, some countries here, more conservative states may go, well, where do our values actually lie? And it doesn't mean that it's some pro-Russian influence, but it should be of concern to NATO if there are countries who, in democratically elected processes, are going, well, we want to move on a different trajectory that maybe a country like France or Italy is on. Again, the future of the EU, we have no idea. Many say it will collapse. Many are saying plenty of things are collapsing. Laura Stefan, a legal expert at Think Tank Expert Forum, has said the ruling shows the weakness of the Romanian state, the vulnerabilities of institutions that were not able to identify early on in the process the Russian interference. So saying they weren't able to identify the interference of the Russians early in the process. Again, we don't know how much interference, if at all, there actually was. Romania's top security council declassified documents on Wednesday saying the country was a target of aggressive, hybrid Russian attacks. Russia has denied any interference in Romania's election campaigns. The court, which has validated the first presidential round on Monday, said its Friday reversal that the declassified documents were showed the entire electoral process had been spoiled through vote manipulation, campaign irregularities, and non-transparent funding. Again, with this, where I'm not seeing a real smoking gun, because they had validated the first presidential round, and then Friday has reversed declassified documents and then thrown it basically in the bin, needing to rerun it. With interference, if there is interference, what is an important piece is how much did that interference actually then change the results? But if there was not interference in this and it is rerun and he is allowed to run again, then he will win by a landslide, because many may jump across and go, hang on, you're rerunning this, even if you've got rid of the interference, it may swing people across and go, look what the state may be trying to do. And if he is allowed to run again, this could be a fantastic informational victory as well. In a statement to television station, Georgescu called in the court ruling an official coup. Evidence of what he said was a corrupt system showing its face. Lasconi condemned the court's ruling. The Constitutional Court's decision is illegal, immoral, and crushes the very essence of democracy, voting. Of course, they hadn't seen this earlier. It's only when the results started to look like what they didn't want has now this come up. They failed to find it earlier on. In one of the declassified documents, Romanian intelligence agency said Georgescu was massively promoted on social media platform TikTok through coordinated accounts. TikTok's a Chinese app, recommendation algorithms, and paid promotion. Georgescu has declared zero funds spent in the campaign. TikTok denies giving Georgescu special treatment. Although recommendation algorithms, these do work, and the special treatment is of how many people are interacting with that. So it can look like the hot girl on TikTok gets special treatment over me, but it's just more people are going to be reacting to that post than I. The intelligence also said login data from official Romanian election websites was published on Russian cybercrime platforms. It added and identified more than 85,000 cyber attacks that aim to exploit system vulnerabilities. But again, how much influence does this actually have on the election if it occurred? We spoke about this with Trump and then potential Russian influence there. How much influence did it have? And what I'll show is how much influence did it have. Okay, if there's a campaign that can have this much influence through social media, through this, through paid promotion, other politicians are already going to be doing this legally just to get their step ahead internally, domestically. How much does that international interference actually have? So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is a question to be had. Is it 5% of voters? Is it 50% of voters can be influenced? And the reason I'll say I don't think it's actually very high is Google, so YouTube, everyone under that, mainstream media, and the majority of big tech, of course with the exception of X, they did this, in my belief, to promote Harris over Trump. Just look at what happens if you Google Trump and Google Harris. What sort of results come up? Harris is the best versus Trump is evil, sort of like search recommendations. And it didn't work. Trump still won. So it needs to be accounted. If there is interference, it needs to be looked at. Yes, but how much is that actually changing election results too? Because I believe moving forward, any election with social media, there's going to be some level of interference from either massive big tech companies through to foreign or internal governments also. Experts predicted that Georgescu would be barred from running again, which this is going to be a big problem in Romania with how popular he is. You can just see his popularity on social media too. It is extremely likely the court will not allow Kalen Georgescu to run again. This is Sergei Miskio, a political science professor at Babes Boulay University. Now, this runs into another problem here. What if there is interference, but it's targeted towards a candidate without their knowledge, and then they get banned? If this occurs, so if there's interference and Georgescu didn't know it, so say the Russians or the Chinese or whoever are pushing on Georgescu without him knowing, he's just, oh shit, this video on TikTok's going well, without him knowing, and then he gets banned, this means that foreign players can get anyone banned from running. All foreign states have to do is promote the side they don't like and then have them banned. See what I mean? So if the opposition here, if X country doesn't like them, okay, then let's put some money and some bots and whatever on their stuff, day of the election, pull it out, and therefore get them banned. This is such a hard thing to do. So Georgescu here, maybe he never knew if there is interference, and that's still an if in my opinion, but if there is, if he wasn't aware of it, what then happens then? You bar him from that. That means that any of these democratic systems can be completely undercut by, okay, well, we don't like, say in Australia, we have Albanese and Dutton. Let's say a foreign player goes, well, we don't like Dutton. Or they don't have to tell Dutton they're going to put money in. They just promote that in algorithm, run some bots, and then he gets pushed out of the election under interference. Huge problem that the powers of the world, if they want to maintain democratic systems, they need to look into that massively and how that actually affects things. There will be street protests. People will become radicalised depending on which candidate from the radical right remains in the race. People will rally around him. So yes, even if Georgescu gets pushed out from his party, whoever runs, I think will then have an absolutely massive victory in Romania if that is allowed to occur. A lot going on around the world. Legends, you have a fantastic rest of your weekend, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.